He was a man made of quiet corners and the slow turning of pages. For 3 months, he had been a fixture in Ilara's cafe, as reliable as the morning sun, though he brought with him the profound stillness of twilight. He always chose the same booth, the one in the back tucked away from the river of people flowing past the large front window, a small table that existed in its own pocket of shadow and calm. He would arrive precisely at 4 in the afternoon, when the lunch rush had long since faded and the evening patrons had not yet begun to trickle in. The bell above the door would offer a gentle, unobtrusive chime, and there he would be, tall and severe in his dark, immaculately tailored coat, his presence a sudden, deep note in the cafe's gentle hum. He never ordered coffee. He asked only for a pot of Earl Grey tea, which he never drank. Ilara would bring it to him, the steam coiling from the spout of the small ceramic pot like a captured ghost. He would incline his head, a gesture of thanks so subtle it was almost imperceptible, his eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, lifting from his book for only a moment. Then he would return to the printed words, and the tea would sit, growing cold beside his elbow. He would stay for 2 hours. At 6, he would place a few heavy coins on the table, enough to cover the tea and a generous tip, and then he would be gone, the bell chiming his departure, leaving behind only the cold tea and an impression of profound, unshakable loneliness. Her cafe, the daily grind, was her sanctuary. A small, warm space that smelled of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and old wood. It was a place of gentle routines, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of spoons against ceramic, the low murmur of conversations that rose and fell like a tide. Ilara knew her regulars by name, by their orders, by the small dramas of their lives. There was Mrs. Gable who needed her scone warmed just so, and the 2 university students who debated philosophy over endless cups of black coffee, and the young writer who typed furiously on a laptop, fueled by a triple-shot latte. They were a part of the cafe's ecosystem, familiar and comforting. The man in the corner booth, however, remained an enigma. He was not a part of the ecosystem, he was a silent observer of it, a still point around which the life of her cafe revolved. She called him Cation in her mind. The name had come to her one rainy afternoon as she watched him, his posture impossibly straight, his focus on his leather-bound book absolute. He looked like a Cation, a name that felt old and solid, like stone. She noticed things about him, small details that accumulated over the weeks. The silver threads in his dark hair at the temples, fine as spun moonlight. The faint, almost invisible scars that traced the back of his left hand. The fact that he never unbuttoned his coat, no matter how warm she kept the cafe. And his stillness. It was more than just calm, it was a cessation of movement so complete it felt unnatural. He did not fidget or shift his weight. He breathed, she assumed, but she could never see the rise and fall of his chest. He simply existed in her corner booth, a figure from another time, another world. Her curiosity was a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface of her days. It wasn't a nosy or intrusive feeling, but rather a gentle pull, a sense of a story waiting to be understood. She found herself watching him in the reflection of the espresso machine, polishing a glass until it squeaked just to have an excuse to linger near his side of the room. She wondered what he was reading. The books were always old, bound in dark leather with no titles on the spines. She wondered where he came from, what he did before 4 o'clock, and where he went after 6. He was a blank page, and she, a lover of stories, longed to read him. One Tuesday, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she brought him his tea along with a small almond croissant, fresh from the oven and dusted with powdered sugar, nestled on its own small plate. She set it down beside his untouched teapot. "On the house," she said, her voice softer than she intended. For the first time, he did not immediately return to his book. His gaze remained on her, and the full force of his attention was startling. It was like standing on a cliff edge and looking down into a deep, dark sea. There was an ancient weight in his eyes, a sorrow that seemed to seep into the very air around them. "That is very kind of you," he said. His voice was low and resonant, each word carefully formed, as if he were unaccustomed to speaking. "But I'm afraid it would be wasted on me." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Oh, I'm sorry, I just thought." "It is a kind thought," he repeated, and the corner of his mouth tilted in something that was not quite a smile, but a shadow of one. It was a fleeting, heartbreakingly weary expression. "Thank you, Ilara." He knew her name. The realization sent a small shock through her. She had a simple name tag pinned to her apron, but few customers ever used her name. She had certainly never told it to him. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight, and retreat behind the safety of her counter. She watched him for the rest of his stay. He didn't touch the croissant, of course, but he didn't push it away either. It sat there, a small, warm offering on the table between them, a bridge she had tried to build. When he left at 6, the croissant was still there, but the air in the cafe felt different. The silence he left behind was no longer empty, it was filled with the echo of her name, spoken in his low, quiet voice. The mystery of him had deepened, but now it had a new layer, a thread of connection, however fragile. And Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was no longer just about curiosity. It was about the profound, aching loneliness she saw in his eyes, a loneliness that she recognized, because it was a distant cousin to her own. The almond croissant became a silent ritual. Every day at 4, she would bring him his tea and a small pastry, a slice of lemon drizzle cake, a pain au chocolat, a simple shortbread cookie. And every day, he would give her that same ghost of a smile and that same quiet, formal thanks. The pastry would sit untouched, a small, sweet testament to a conversation they weren't having. But the space between them had changed. His brief glance when she arrived at his table now lingered a moment longer. Sometimes, his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cafe, a dark, unreadable gaze that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. It wasn't menacing. It was watchful, attentive, as if he were memorizing the way she wiped down a table or the practiced ease with which she frothed milk. One evening, a fierce autumn storm broke over the city. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled a mournful song down the narrow street. The cafe, usually empty by 5:30, held a few stranded customers, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the pendant lights. Cation was in his booth, the storm outside seeming only to deepen the pool of stillness around him. Ilara was wiping down the counter when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into near-total darkness. A collective gasp went through the remaining patrons. "Stay calm, everyone," Ilara called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "The fuse box is just in the back. I'll have them back on in a moment." She felt her way toward the back room, her hands skimming the cool surface of the counter. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. She fumbled for the handle to the storeroom, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. As her fingers closed around the cold metal, another hand covered hers. It was large, firm, and impossibly, shockingly cold. Not the chill of a rainy day, but a deep, profound cold that felt as if it came from the earth itself, from a place the sun had never touched. She gasped and tried to pull away, but the hand held her fast. "Allow me," Cation's voice said, his words a low murmur directly beside her ear. He hadn't made a sound. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't sensed him move from his booth. He had simply appeared out of the suffocating blackness like a phantom. Before she could form a reply, he released her hand and she heard the faint click of the storeroom door opening. He moved past her into the deeper darkness within. A moment later, a single, brilliant point of light bloomed in the doorway. It wasn't a match or a lighter. It was a small, steady flame, whiter than silver, that hovered in the air just above his open palm. It cast long, dancing shadows across the shelves of supplies, illuminating his face from below. His features, usually softened by the cafe's warm light, were thrown into sharp relief. The severe lines of his cheekbones, the deep-set darkness of his eyes, the aristocratic arch of his brow. In that strange, cold light, he looked ancient and powerful, a king from a forgotten age. He glanced at her, and his expression was unreadable. "The fuse box," he prompted gently. Numbly, she pointed. "On the wall. To the left." He moved to it, the floating flame drifting along with him. He didn't seem to touch the box. He simply held his other hand before it, and with a soft hum and a crackle of static, the lights in the cafe flickered back to life, buzzing with a sudden, renewed energy. The small, magical flame in his palm vanished as if it had never been. The other customers blinked and murmured in relief, their brief adventure in the dark already becoming an amusing story to tell. But Ilara could only stare at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He turned back to her, and the mask of the quiet, unassuming patron was back in place, but she had seen what was beneath it. She had felt his impossible cold, seen his impossible light. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, and for a second, she saw a flicker of something that looked like regret. "An old trick," he said, his voice a low dismissal. She found her own voice, though it was thin and shaky. "What are you?" The question hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of rain, the chatter from the front of the cafe, it all faded away. There was only the two of them in the storeroom doorway, surrounded by the mundane smells of cleaning supplies and cardboard. He held her gaze, and the weariness in his own was so profound it was like a physical weight. "I am a customer," he said softly. "One who is grateful for your kindness, and for your tea." He stepped past her, moving back into the main room with that unnerving silence of his. He returned to his booth, picked up his book, and placed his usual payment on the table. Then, without a backward glance, he walked out of the cafe, the bell chiming his exit into the stormy night. He was an hour early. He left behind his cold tea, his untouched pastry, and a silence that was no longer just lonely, but filled with a terrifying, impossible truth. Ilara stood frozen, her hand still tingling with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The world she knew, the comfortable, predictable world of coffee and kindness, had just cracked wide open. For 2 days, he didn't come. The corner booth remained empty, a void in the fabric of her afternoon routine. Ilara found her eyes drawn to it constantly, expecting to see his dark form, only to be met with the sight of an empty table. The silence he'd left behind had grown, sprawling out to fill the entire cafe. The hiss of the steamer sounded too loud, the chatter of customers too bright. She felt his absence like a missing tooth, a space she couldn't stop probing with her tongue. She replayed the incident in the storeroom over and over in her mind, the shocking cold of his hand, the impossible white flame, the ancient power she had glimpsed in his eyes. An old trick, he'd called it. It was no trick. It was magic, real and terrifying and beautiful. The question she had asked him, "What are you?" haunted her. She began to search for answers, though she didn't know what she was looking for. She started at the city library, a grand, dusty old building that smelled of decaying paper and beeswax polish. She bypassed the brightly lit sections of new fiction and headed for the archives, the local history collection stored in the quiet, climate-controlled basement. She told the archivist she was researching old folklore for a personal project. The woman, a kindly soul with spectacles perched on the end of her nose, was only too happy to help. Ilara spent hours poring over brittle, yellowed maps and leather-bound town histories. She read about the founding of the city, its trade routes, its mundane political squabbles. It was all disappointingly normal. Then, in a slim volume of regional myths and legends, she found him. Not by name, but by description. The book spoke of the blighted lands, a vast, desolate territory that bordered the kingdom to the north, a place where crops withered and the trees were skeletal and grey. Legend claimed it was ruled by a pale king, a being as old as the mountains, who was bound to his dying land. The stories were varied and contradictory. Some painted him as a monster, a night feeder who drained the life from his domain to sustain himself. Others depicted him as a tragic, solitary figure, a cursed guardian watching over a slow, inevitable decay. One passage, scribbled in the margin by a long-dead reader, caught her eye. His touch is the winter's heart. He cannot feel warmth, for he is bound to the cold earth. He is the warden of a kingdom of dust and echoes. A chill, entirely separate from the library's drafty air, snaked down her spine. His touch is the winter's heart. She thought of his impossibly cold hand covering hers in the darkness. She read on, her fingers tracing the faded print. The legends said the king's life force was interwoven with his land. He was its heart, and it was his body. When a blight had fallen upon the land centuries ago, a magical sickness of unknown origin, it had begun to poison him as well. The book described his affliction as a withering thirst, a craving for the vitality his own kingdom could no longer provide. He was, in essence, a king starving in his own castle, surrounded by a banquet of dust. Ilara checked out the book, along with several others on regional folklore. Back in the quiet of her small apartment above the cafe, she spread them across her living room floor. She found more mentions of him, more fragments of the story. A forgotten poem spoke of the Sorrow King who walked in shadow and could not partake of mortal food or drink. An old folk tale warned children not to wander too far north, lest they stumble into the king's grey garden where nothing grew. Each piece was another brushstroke, painting a portrait of a being trapped in an eternal, agonizing decline. A vampire. Not the romantic, predatory creature of modern novels, but something far older, sadder. A king whose curse was not immortality, but an eternity of watching his world, and himself, slowly fade to nothing. It all clicked into place. The untouched tea and pastries, his preference for the shadows, the profound weariness in his eyes. He wasn't just lonely, he was dying. A slow, centuries-long death. And his visits to her cafe, they weren't for sustenance. They were for something else. He came to her warm, vibrant, bustling little world to sit and watch, to remember what life felt like. The smell of coffee, the sound of laughter, the sight of sunlight slanting through the window, it was a life he could observe but never touch. He was a ghost at the feast, and her cafe was his window to a world he had lost. The thought was so tragic, so deeply painful, that it took her breath away. Her curiosity had been replaced by a vast, aching wave of empathy. He wasn't a monster to be feared. He was a prisoner, and his cage was his own kingdom. On the third day, he returned. The bell chimed at 4 o'clock, and Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. He looked the same, tall, dark, and contained, but she saw him differently now. She saw the weight of centuries on his shoulders, the blight of his kingdom reflected in the depths of his eyes. He moved to his corner booth, and she watched him, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a ceramic teapot. She knew she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't go back to the silent ritual of untouched pastries and unspoken questions. She had to let him know that she saw him. Not the monster of legend, but the man, the king, suffering beneath it. Taking a deep breath, she carried the tea to his table. But this time, she didn't bring a pastry. Instead, she carried one of the old folklore books from the library, its leather cover worn smooth with age. She placed the teapot down, and then, with deliberate care, she laid the book on the table beside it, its pages opened to the chapter on the Pale King. Caitian's eyes, which had been on his own book, lifted. They flickered from her face to the open book on the table. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He simply looked tired. A deep, bone-weary resignation settled over his features, as if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. He slowly closed his own book, the soft thud of the cover echoing in the quiet space between them. Ilara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she held his gaze. She didn't want to accuse him or expose him. She wanted to understand. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The curse?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the illustration on the page, a stylized depiction of a lone, crowned figure standing in a barren, leafless forest. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history and sorrow. Ilara felt a sudden fear that she had overstepped, that she had shattered the fragile peace between them and he would simply get up and leave, this time for good. She was about to apologize, to snatch the book back and retreat, when he finally spoke. "Some of it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The stories people tell are like rivers. They pick up mud and stones along the way. The shape of the truth changes over time. But the blight," she pressed gently. "Your land, it's dying?" He inclined his head, a slow, heavy gesture of confirmation. "It has been for longer than your city has stood. And I with it." The simple, unadorned confession landed with the weight of a gravestone. It was real. All of it. The king, the curse, the slow, unending decay. She sank into the chair opposite him, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not an enigma, but a man carrying an impossible burden. She saw the faint lines of pain etched around his eyes, the rigid control in his posture that spoke of a constant, draining battle. "Why here?" she whispered, gesturing vaguely to the cafe around them. "Why come here every day?" A flicker of something, a deep, ancient pain, passed across his face. To remember the scent of baked bread, he said, his voice quiet and raw. To hear the sound of a spoon stirring sugar into a cup. To watch the light change. To sit in a room full of life, even if I cannot partake in it. He looked at her then, and his gaze was so direct, so vulnerable, it felt as if he were laying his soul bare on the table between them. I come here, Ilara, to feel the warmth of a sun I can no longer stand in. And your presence, it is the warmest part. The sincerity in his voice undid her. A tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. It wasn't pity she felt, but a profound connection, a shared understanding of loneliness that transcended the vast differences between them. He was a king, and she was a cafe owner. He was ancient and fading, and she was young and alive. But in that moment, they were just two lonely souls sitting in the quiet corner of a world that was, for one of them, slipping away. My name is Cation, he said, formally introducing himself after months of silent observation. I know, she replied, a watery smile touching her lips. I hoped it might be. The confession hung in the air, a delicate, shimmering thing. It changed everything. The boundary between them, the counter, the table, the vast chasm between mortal and immortal, had dissolved. He was no longer just the man in the corner, he was Cation, a dying king who came to her cafe to remember what it felt like to be alive. The knowledge settled in Ilara's chest, heavy and sharp. It was a truth far more tragic than any folklore could capture. They talked for the rest of the afternoon, their voices low, a secret current in the gentle river of the cafe's atmosphere. The sun dipped below the city's skyline, painting the window in hues of orange and violet, and for the first time, Cation didn't leave at 6. He told her of his kingdom, not as it was, but as it had been. He spoke of vast, ancient forests with trees so tall their leaves brushed the clouds, of rivers that ran with water so pure it chimed like bells, of a people who were wise and deeply connected to the magic of the land. He described it with the loving, painful detail of a man recalling a lost love. His words painted a world of breathtaking beauty, now reduced to dust and silence. The blight came like a thief in the night, he explained, his hands resting on the table, still and pale. It was a poison to the land's magic. It leached the color from the leaves, soured the water, and drove the life from the soil. And because my life, my magic, is woven into the land, it began to poison me as well. He gestured to the untouched teapot. Mortal food holds no sustenance for me now. It is like ash in my mouth. The blight created a hunger for something else. A hunger for vitality. For life itself. Vampire. The word hung unspoken between them. You mean, blood? Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. He met her gaze without flinching. That is what the hunger demands. It is the vessel of life. But I am a king, Ilara. My first and only duty is to protect life, not consume it. I have not fed on a living soul since the blight began. I have sustained myself on the fading echoes of life in my kingdom, on animals that wander into its borders. But there is less and less to draw from. The land is almost empty now. And so am I. The sheer, staggering force of his will, his centuries of restraint in the face of an all-consuming hunger, was almost incomprehensible. He was starving himself, withering away alongside his kingdom, because he refused to become the monster the curse wanted him to be. The stories that painted him as a predator were wrong. He was a protector, a shepherd with no flock, a king ruling over a graveyard. There must be something that can be done, she insisted, leaning forward, her hands clenched into fists on the table. A cure. A way to break the curse. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it was devastating. In 800 years, I have consulted every scholar, every sorcerer, every ancient text. I have traveled to the ends of the earth in search of an answer. If there was a cure, I would have found it. His voice was gentle, but laced with the steel of absolute certainty. He had accepted his fate. But Ilara had not. The idea of him simply fading away, of this kind, honorable, and profoundly lonely man succumbing to this slow-motion tragedy, was unacceptable. A fierce, protective instinct flared within her, hot and bright. It was absurd. She was a woman who ran a coffee shop. What could she possibly do against an ancient, magical curse? But looking at him, at the quiet dignity with which he faced his own extinction, she knew she had to try. "You've looked for a cure for the curse on you," she said, a thought taking shape in her mind. "But you said your life is tied to the land. What if the cure isn't for you? What if it's for the land itself?" He stilled, his dark eyes fixed on her. The idea seemed to hang in the air, something he had perhaps considered and discarded long ago. "The blight is not a simple poison, Elara. It is an unmaking. A corruption of the very essence of life. To heal the land would require a magic more powerful than that which created the blight. A magic of pure life. And that doesn't exist. It is rare," he admitted slowly. "It is the magic of creation, of beginnings. It is not something one can learn or wield. It simply is." He fell silent then, a shadow passing over his face. He seemed to retreat back into himself, the brief opening closing up again. The conversation was over. As if on cue, the clock on the wall chimed 7 times. He looked at it, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had stayed an hour past his usual time. He rose from the booth, his movements fluid and silent. "I have kept you too long," he said, his voice once again formal. "No," she said, standing as well. "Cation. Don't give up." He looked at her, and the sorrow in his eyes was a physical thing, a deep, dark ocean. "Hope is a luxury I lost centuries ago, Elara. But I thank you for the sentiment." He placed his usual payment on the table and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "Thank you, for the conversation. It was a kindness." And then he was gone, the bell a lonely farewell. Elara stood by the table, her hand resting on the folklore book. Kindness. He saw her questions, her prodding, as a kindness. She looked around her little cafe, at the warm lights and the steam fogging the windows against the night. This place was her life, her world. It was a world of warmth and vitality. The very things his world had lost. A magic of pure life, he had said. She didn't know what that meant, or where to find it. But as she blew out the candles on the empty tables and locked the door for the night, a stubborn, unyielding resolve took root in her heart. He may have lost hope, but she had just found it. And she would hold on to it for both of them. The next day, Cation did not come. Nor the day after. A week passed, and the corner booth remained hauntingly empty. The fear that she had driven him away for good was a cold knot in Elara's stomach. She had breached the careful distance he maintained, forced him to speak of a pain he had carried in silence for centuries. Perhaps it had been too much. Perhaps her clumsy attempt at hope had been an insult to his long-suffering despair. The cafe felt hollow without his still presence. Every chime of the bell on the door made her head snap up, a frantic hope flaring in her chest, only to be extinguished by the sight of a stranger's face. She did not let the silence defeat her. She spent every spare moment, before the cafe opened, after it closed, devouring the books from the library. She expanded her search, requesting interlibrary loans of obscure, forgotten texts on magical botany, elemental geology, and arcane theory. Her small apartment became a chaotic nest of books and papers, maps spread across the floor, notes pinned to every available surface. She learned about ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the earth. She read about heartwoods, ancient trees that acted as the focal point for a forest's vitality. She pieced together theories about symbiotic magic, where 2 different essences could be bound together to create a new, stable whole. Most of it was dense, academic, and seemingly useless. But she persisted, driven by the image of his tired, sad face. She was searching for a miracle in the footnotes of forgotten history. One rainy afternoon, tucked into the appendix of a crumbling tome on metaphysical geographies, she found it. It was a short, almost dismissive entry about a phenomenon called a life gift. The text described it as a willing transference of vitality, not through a spell or a ritual, but through an act of profound, selfless empathy. It wasn't about blood or sacrifice in the violent sense. It was about offering a piece of one's own life force, one's own connection to the world, to mend a place that was broken. The author called it a fairy tale, a symbolic myth about the power of love. But the description was so specific, so detailed. It spoke of a conduit, a person with a strong, innate connection to the living world, and an anchor, the broken person or place. Through the conduit, a sliver of the world's vitality could be channeled into the anchor, not to cure it instantly, but to plant a seed of healing. A seed that could, with time, grow and push back the blight. A magic of pure life. An act of profound, selfless empathy. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was the answer. But the text came with a stark warning. Such a gift was costly. The conduit would not die, but they would be forever changed. A part of them would become tied to the anchor, their own life force dimmed, their senses muted. They would feel a constant, faint echo of the anchor's pain, a shadow of the blight within themselves. They would, in essence, be sharing the burden of the curse. She sat on the floor of her apartment, the book open in her lap, the rain drumming a soft tattoo on the windowpane. Share the burden. The words resonated deep within her. To feel a shadow of his pain, to carry a piece of his loneliness, it wasn't a terrifying prospect. It felt right. It was the only thing that made sense. What was a muted world compared to his empty one? What was a shadow of pain compared to his centuries of agony? She had spent her life creating a small pocket of warmth and life in her cafe. Now, she had the chance to offer that same warmth to him, to his entire world. Her decision was made before she even consciously acknowledged it. That night, she didn't go to bed. She packed a small bag with a thermos of water, a loaf of bread, and a compass. She put on her sturdiest walking boots and a warm, waterproof coat. In her pocket, she placed a small, smooth stone from the riverbank behind her cafe, a piece of her world to carry into his. She left a note for her part-time employee, saying she had a family emergency and would be gone for a few days. Then, just before dawn, she locked the door of her cafe, took a deep breath of the cool, damp air, and began to walk north. The journey was a descent. The city, with its noise and light and life, gave way to sprawling suburbs, which in turn bled into rolling farmland. The colors were vibrant, the air rich with the smell of damp earth and growing things. But as she continued north, following the old, disused road mentioned on the crumbling maps, the world began to change. The transformation was subtle at first. The green of the grass seemed less saturated. The birdsong grew thin, then disappeared entirely. The rich, dark soil gave way to pale, sandy earth. Then she saw the first of the blighted trees. It stood alone in a field, a skeletal silhouette against the grey sky, its branches twisted and black as if charred by a fire that had left no heat. The further she walked, the more profound the decay became. She crossed the invisible border into his kingdom, and it was like stepping from a living world into a photograph of one. The color had been leached from everything. The trees were bone-white or charcoal grey, their leafless branches clawing at a sky the color of ash. The ground was a carpet of fine, grey dust that rose in silent puffs with each footstep. There was no wind, no sound, no movement. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on her from all sides. It was a kingdom of ghosts, a monument to a slow, creeping death. And it was vast. It stretched to the horizon in every direction, a landscape of profound and utter desolation. The sheer scale of the blight was overwhelming. Her small, hopeful plan suddenly felt naive, a child's wish against an ocean of despair. How could her single, insignificant life force possibly make a difference here? Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. But then she thought of Cation, sitting in her vibrant cafe, his eyes full of this unending, silent emptiness. He had carried this world within him for 800 years. She could not turn back. She pressed on, the river stone in her pocket her only comfort, a small, solid reminder of the world she was fighting for. For a day and a night, she walked through the grey wasteland. The air was cold and thin, and it tasted of dust. She ate her bread, which felt dry and tasteless in her mouth, and drank her water, but nothing could wash away the profound sense of wrongness that permeated the land. Late on the second day, she saw it in the distance, a dark spire rising from the grey plains, a shard of black glass piercing the sky. A castle. His castle. As she drew closer, she saw that it was not made of stone, but of some dark, volcanic rock that seemed to drink the light. It was a fortress of sorrow, stark and forbidding, the heart of the dying kingdom. She reached the massive gates as dusk settled, the grey sky deepening to a bruised purple. The gates were wrought iron, twisted into the shapes of thorny, leafless vines. They were closed, but not locked. With a deep breath, summoning the last of her courage, she pushed one open. It swung inward without a sound, opening into a vast, silent courtyard. The castle loomed over her, its windows like vacant eyes. She was terrified, but she didn't hesitate. She walked across the courtyard, her footsteps echoing in the crushing silence, and approached the great wooden doors of the keep. Before she could touch them, one of them swung open. Cation stood in the doorway, a figure of shadow against the deeper darkness within. He was not wearing his immaculate mortal coat, but a simple tunic of dark grey, and for the first time, she saw the true extent of his unnatural thinness, the sharp angles of his body. He looked not at her face, but at her boots, covered in the grey dust of his domain. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and a pain so profound it was breathtaking. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual careful control. It was the voice of the Sorrow King, the warden of this wasteland. "You left," she said simply, her own voice trembling slightly. "You didn't come back. This place is poison, Ilara. It will leech the life from you. Every moment you stand on this land, it is unmaking you." "Then let it," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I read about a way. A life gift. I came to help." He stared at her, and for a long moment, he was utterly still. She saw a war in his eyes, a flicker of desperate, impossible hope warring with centuries of ingrained resignation. The hope was terrifying to him, she could see it. It was a sharp, unfamiliar thing that threatened the careful armor of his despair. Finally, the resignation won. He shook his head, a slow, final gesture. "That is a myth," he said, his voice flat. "A children's story told to make the darkness seem less absolute. There is no such magic." "I don't believe that," she said, taking a step closer. "And I don't think you do either. You're just afraid to hope. Hope is a cruel thing to offer a dying man," he whispered, and the agony in that whisper broke her heart. "Please, Ilara. Go back. Go back to your warm, bright world. Forget you ever saw this place. Forget me." "I can't," she said, and her voice was firm now, filled with the certainty of her purpose. She closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just before him in the grand, cold doorway of his castle. She reached out and, before he could pull away, she placed her hand flat against his chest. Through the thin fabric of his tunic, she could feel the impossible, deathly cold of his skin. But beneath it, she could also feel a faint, slow, thready beat. The heart of the land. The heart of the king. It was still there. Faint, but fighting. "I can't," she repeated softly, "because you're not a dying man. You're a king. And I'm not going to let you lose your kingdom." The air in the great hall was as cold and still as a tomb. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of grey light slanting from high, arched windows. Cation stood frozen, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a fragile, nascent hope he clearly didn't know how to handle. Her hand was a small patch of impossible warmth against the profound chill of his chest, a stark contrast of life and decay. He made no move to push her away. It was as if he had forgotten how to move at all. "It is not a myth," Ilara insisted, her voice resonating with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "It's just that no one has been willing to try. No one has been willing to share the burden." "Share the burden," he echoed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Ilara, you don't understand what you are offering. This blight, it is not a simple sadness. It is an active, malevolent emptiness. It is a constant gnawing at the edges of your soul. It is the taste of ash in every memory, the silence that swallows every joy. To invite even a shadow of that into yourself, it would break you." "Let it try," she said, her fingers pressing slightly, feeling that faint, stubborn rhythm beneath his skin. "My world is full enough of joy and warmth to spare a little. Let me be your conduit. Let me anchor you back to the living world." He finally moved, his hands coming up to gently, carefully, close around her wrist, as if to pull her hand away. But he didn't. He just held her there, his touch a circle of winter around her skin. His thumbs stroked the back of her wrist, a gesture of such aching tenderness that it made her throat tighten. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a bright creature in a cafe, but as a force of nature in her own right, a will as unyielding as his own centuries of endurance. "Why?" he asked, the single word laden with the weight of 800 years of solitude. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because for months, you came to my cafe and you never asked for anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You just watched, and you listened, and you let us all be alive around you. You guarded our small joys with your silent presence. You reminded me that even in the quiet corners, there is a story worth knowing. You showed me a loneliness deeper than my own, and you never burdened me with it. Now, let me show you that you don't have to be lonely anymore." A shudder went through his tall frame. A single, dark tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his pale, sculpted cheek. It was a startling sight, a crack in the marble facade of his control. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers, his cold skin a shock against her own. She could feel the fine tremor that ran through him. "The heart of the land is deep beneath this castle," he murmured, his voice muffled against her. "It is a place of great power, and great pain. If this is even possible, it must be done there. But I am giving you one last chance, Elara. Walk out that door. Return to the sun. I will not stop you." She didn't need to answer. She simply tightened her hand against his chest, a silent vow. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of surrender, of a dam breaking after an eternity of holding back the tide. He lifted his head, his eyes locking with hers. The despair was still there, but now, beside it, was a tiny, terrifying flicker of light. Hope. He had let it in. "Then come," he said. "And may the world forgive me for what I am about to let you do." He led her from the great hall, his hand still loosely encircling her wrist, not as a captor, but as a guide, an anchor of his own. They moved through silent, cavernous corridors, their footsteps the only sound in the sleeping castle. The air grew colder, heavier, as they descended, taking winding stone staircases deeper and deeper into the rock upon which the castle was built. The light from the high windows faded, and soon they were walking in a darkness that felt absolute. But Cation moved with unerring confidence, his grip on her wrist the only thing that kept her from stumbling. He was a creature of this gloom, it was his natural element. Finally, they came to a halt before a simple, unadorned stone door set into the raw rock wall. It had no handle, no lock. Cation released her wrist and placed his palm flat against the stone. Faint, silvery lines of light spread from his fingertips, tracing patterns like dormant roots across the door's surface. With a low groan of grinding stone, the door swung inward, revealing a vast, circular cavern. The air that washed over them was ancient and sorrowful. In the center of the cavern, a massive, crystalline heart pulsed with a dim, sickly violet light. It was the size of a carriage, a great, multifaceted geode of what looked like amethyst, but its light was weak, guttering like a dying candle. Dark, creeping veins of blackness marred its surface, spreading like a spiderweb from a central point of decay. This was the heart of the kingdom. And it was dying. Surrounding the heart, great, gnarled roots of stone and crystal grew out from the cavern floor, reaching up like supplicating hands. "This is the heartwood of the land," Cation said, his voice a reverent whisper. "All the life and magic of my kingdom flows from it. Or it did, once." He led her to the edge of the dais where the heart rested. The violet light cast strange shadows on his face, making him look both impossibly old and achingly young. The faint, slow beat she had felt in his chest was stronger here, a deep, sorrowful thump-thump that was more a vibration in the bones than a sound. "The blight is centered there," he said, pointing to the darkest part of the crystalline heart, where the black veins converged. A shard of pure negation, a splinter of antimagic, embedded in its core centuries ago by an enemy long turned to dust. It has been poisoning the heartwood ever since he turned to her, his expression grave. "If you are to do this, you must place your hands upon the heart. You must open yourself to it, and to me. You must become the bridge." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "It will hurt." "I know," she said, her voice steady. She stepped forward, onto the dais. The stone was cold beneath her feet, but it thrummed with a faint, residual power. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the cool, smooth surface of the crystalline heart. The moment her skin made contact, a jolt went through her. It was not an electric shock, but a shock of pure emotion. A wave of 800 years of pain, loneliness, and despair washed over her, a tsunami of silent agony. It was Caitian's pain, the land's pain, intertwined and inseparable. She gasped, staggering back, the sheer force of it threatening to overwhelm her. Caitian was there instantly, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "Ilara," he said, his voice tight with alarm. "It is too much." "No," she breathed, shaking her head, fighting to find her footing in the torrent of sorrow. "No. I can do this." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "But I can't do it alone. You said I am the bridge. A bridge has two sides. You have to be the other side. You have to hold on to me." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. He moved to stand behind her, his body a tall, solid presence at her back. He reached around her, placing his large, cold hands over hers on the crystal heart. His chill seeped into her skin, a stark contrast to the thrumming pain from the heartwood. She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his physical presence. His chin brushed the top of her head. They were connected now, her, him, and the dying land. "Now," he whispered, his voice a command against her hair. "Open your heart, Ilara. Don't think about the pain. Think about your cafe. Think about the smell of rain on hot pavement. Think of the sun on your face. Find the brightest, warmest part of your world, and offer it. Offer it to the darkness." She closed her eyes. She shut out the crushing wave of despair and focused inward. She pictured her cafe at sunrise, the first golden rays of light streaming through the front window, illuminating the swirling dust motes. She smelled the rich, dark aroma of freshly ground coffee. She heard the gentle clink of ceramic, the low murmur of her first customers of the day. She felt the warmth of a mug in her hands, the simple, profound comfort of it. She gathered up every small, perfect, living moment she had ever known, the taste of a wild strawberry, the sound of laughter, the feeling of cool grass beneath her bare feet. She wove them together into a single, brilliant point of light within her chest. It was a small light against an ocean of darkness, but it was pure, and it was hers. Then, with every ounce of her will, she pushed that light outward, down her arms, through her hands, and into the dying heart of the land. The moment her light touched the crystal, the cavern erupted. A silent scream of energy tore through the space, a clash of life and anti-life. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 times worse than before. It felt as if she were being ripped apart, her very essence unraveled. The blight fought back, a force of cold, hungry nothingness that tried to extinguish her light, to consume her. She cried out, her body arching in agony. But Caitian's arms wrapped around her, holding her upright, his body a shield. He was murmuring something against her ear, not words, but a low, ancient chant, a litany of names, the names of mountains and rivers and forests that had long since turned to dust. He was reminding the land of what it had been, giving her, offering a direction, a purpose. Her light, her warmth, her life, poured into the heartwood. It was a tiny stream against a raging, black sea, but it did not waver. It struck the core of the blight, the shard of negation, and it did not shatter. It held. She felt the black veins in the crystal resist, felt the cold intensify, but she kept pushing, pouring every ounce of herself into the offering. She felt Caitian's own faint, flickering life force join with hers, lending his strength, his will, his love for his land to her own. Their two souls, mortal and immortal, became one in that moment, a single point of defiance against the encroaching dark. And then, something shifted. A single, pure, clear note chimed through the cavern, like a crystal bell being struck. A crack appeared in the black shard at the heart's core. Light, her light, poured into it. The black veins began to recede, not vanishing, but retreating from the heart's center, pulling back like a defeated tide. The sickly violet glow of the heartwood began to brighten, shifting in hue toward a soft, healthy rose gold. The deep, sorrowful beat of the heart began to quicken, to strengthen, growing steadier with every passing second. A warmth, faint but undeniable, began to radiate from the crystal, pushing back the cavern's ancient chill. It was working. The thought was a distant flare of triumph in a universe of pain. It was working. The life gift was real. The blight was not destroyed, but it was contained. The poison was no longer spreading. The seed of healing had been planted. Exhaustion, sudden and absolute, crashed over her. The light within her dimmed, her offering spent. Her strength gave out, and she slumped forward, her consciousness spiraling down into a welcome darkness. The last thing she felt was Caitian's strong arms catching her, lifting her away from the now glowing heart, his voice whispering her name like a prayer. Ilara awoke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless sleep. The first thing she registered was warmth. Not just the absence of cold, but a genuine, gentle warmth that seemed to soak into her bones. She was lying in a large, soft bed, covered by heavy velvet blankets. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth nearby, its golden light dancing on the high, vaulted ceiling. She was in a bedroom in the castle, but the oppressive, sorrowful chill was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching as if from a great exertion. Her body felt different. Subtly altered. There was a faint, persistent thrumming deep within her, a quiet echo of the heartwood's new, stronger rhythm. And beneath it, a faint, cold shadow, a whisper of the blight she had taken into herself. It was there, a part of her now, but it wasn't painful. It was just a quiet, constant reminder of the burden she now shared. The door to the chamber opened, and Caitian entered. He was carrying a wooden tray. He stopped when he saw she was awake, and the look on his face a mixture of profound relief, gratitude, and a tenderness so deep it made her breath catch, was more eloquent than any words. He looked different, too. The stark, deathly pallor of his skin had been softened by a hint of color. The deep, pain-etched lines around his eyes seemed to have eased. He was still a figure of shadow and twilight, but the suffocating weight of the blight had lifted from him. "Ilara," he said, his voice soft. He set the tray down on a nearby table and came to sit on the edge of the bed. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. His skin was still cool, but it was no longer the shocking, unnatural cold of before. It was merely the coolness of a shaded stone, not the chill of the grave. "It worked," she whispered, her voice raspy. "It worked," he confirmed, his thumb stroking her temple. "The heartwood is healing. The blight has been quieted. You saved us, Ilara. You saved my kingdom. You saved me. We saved it," she corrected. "Together." He gave her that rare, sad, beautiful smile. "Yes." Together he looked down at his own hand, then back at her. "I can feel it. The hunger, it is still there, but it is a distant echo, not a roaring beast. The land is breathing again. And for the first time in centuries, so am I." He looked around the room, at the dancing firelight. "There is warmth in my own halls. You brought the sun back with you." On the tray he had brought in, there was a pitcher of water, a loaf of dark bread, and a small, steaming cup. It was not tea. The rich, familiar aroma filled the room, a scent that belonged to her world, not his. It was coffee. "I don't know how to make it properly," he said, a hint of apology in his tone. "But I remembered the smell. I thought you might like it." Tears welled in her eyes. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it was everything. It was him reaching across the divide, trying to bring a piece of her world into his, just as she had done for him. She sat up further, and he passed her the cup. It was warm in her hands, a familiar comfort in this strange, ancient place. She took a sip. It was strong, and a little bitter, but it was perfect. She stayed in the castle for 3 more days, regaining her strength. They walked the silent corridors together, but the silence was different now. It was peaceful, not oppressive. Caitian showed her the castle's vast library, filled with books that chronicled the history of a world she was now inextricably a part of. They stood on the high battlements and looked out over the blighted lands. To her eyes, it still looked grey and desolate, but Caitian saw it differently. "Look," he said, pointing to the base of the castle wall. She followed his gaze, and for a moment, she saw nothing but dust. But then, she saw it. A tiny, miraculous speck of green. A single, hardy blade of grass, pushing its way up through the grey soil. It was the first new life the kingdom had seen in 800 years. A seed of hope, made real. The day came when she knew she had to leave. Her world, her cafe, her life, was waiting. The goodbye was unspoken, a heavy sadness that settled between them as they stood before the great gates. "This will always be your home, Elara," Cation said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "You are a part of this land now. Its queen, if you would have the title." She smiled, a bittersweet ache in her chest. "I think I'm better suited to making coffee than ruling a kingdom. But I will come back. I promise." "I know you will," he said. He stepped forward and gently took her face in his hands. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, of a gratitude so profound it transcended romance. It was a blessing. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. She walked away from the castle, back across the grey plains, but she did not look back. She didn't need to. She could feel him watching her, a steady, comforting presence now linked to her own soul. As she crossed the border out of his kingdom and back into the living world, the colors seemed impossibly vibrant, the air thick with the scent of life. Her own world seemed muted, just as the book had warned. The flavors were a little duller, the sounds a little softer. But it wasn't a loss. It was an exchange. She carried a piece of his silence, and he, a piece of her warmth. 2 weeks later, she was back in her cafe. The routine was the same, the customers were the same, but she was different. The quiet thrum of a healing kingdom was a constant companion within her. At 4 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Elara's heart didn't leap. It simply settled. He stood in the doorway. He wore his dark coat, but he seemed to carry less shadow with him. He looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet, steady light. He walked to the corner booth and sat down. Elara brought him his pot of Earl Grey tea. She set it down on the table, her hand brushing his. His skin was still cool, but it was the coolness of a living thing. He looked from the teapot to her, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a smile that reached his ancient, beautiful eyes. Then, he did something he had never done before. He picked up the teacup, poured the steaming, fragrant liquid into it, and took a sip. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring it. "It's wonderful," he said, his voice full of a quiet, simple joy. He could taste it. The blight's hold was broken enough that he could partake, just a little, in her world. The curse was not gone. The kingdom was not yet healed. Their worlds were still far apart. But the tragedy was over. This was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new normal, a quiet, shared life built across the border of two worlds, one sip of tea at a time. And as Elara returned to her counter, a matching smile on her own lips, she knew that this small, warm cafe had become an embassy, and its two soul ambassadors had finally learned to speak the same language.